No one survives a storm like this, they used to say. And yet Clara Whitmore was still walking when even the wind seemed to have given up on her, her thin boots sinking deeper with every step into drifts that climbed past her knees, the cold biting through layers of worn wool until it reached bone, until it became something quieter, something heavier, like sleep calling her name. Her fingers clutched the small silver locket at her throat, its edges pressing into her skin as if it alone could anchor her to the world she was slipping from. And somewhere in the howling white she thought of warmth, not as memory, but as something distant, almost impossible, like a story she had once believed in before everything had been taken from her. She had not meant to run this far, had not meant to leave the road behind, but fear had driven her forward, fear and the echo of voices she could not forget, voices that had turned from familiar to cold in a single night, leaving her with nothing but the storm and the certainty that going back meant losing more than just her freedom. The wind rose again, sharper now, cutting across the open land with a force that stole the breath from her lungs, and she stumbled, catching herself only barely as her vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing into fragments of white and shadow, each step slower than the last, each breath more fragile than the one before. Somewhere beneath the storm, the faint rhythm of her heartbeat faltered, uneven, distant, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. She tried to focus, to remember why she had to keep moving. But even that reason slipped through her grasp like melting ice, leaving only the instinct to take one more step, and then another, until at last her legs refused her entirely, and she sank into the snow, the cold no longer sharp but soft, almost gentle as it wrapped around her like a quiet promise. Her lashes lowered, heavy with frost, and for a moment the storm seemed to fade, the sound of it drifting farther away, replaced by a strange, echoing stillness that felt like the edge of something final. She did not see the dark figure emerging through the white veil of snow, did not hear the powerful stride that cut through the storm as if it were nothing at all. But somewhere in that fading space between waking and surrender, something shifted, something unseen drawing closer, as though the night itself had chosen not to let her disappear just yet. The first thing he noticed was not her face but the way the storm seemed to bend around her, as if even the wind hesitated to claim what had already been abandoned, and Adrian Blackwood slowed his horse with a quiet command, his gloved hand tightening slightly on the reins as his sharp gaze fixed on the fragile shape half buried beneath the snow. He had ridden these lands for years, through winters harsher than this, and he knew the difference between something lost and something meant to be found, and yet there was no reason for him to stop, no obligation, no mercy left in him that had not long ago been buried beneath colder memories than this storm could ever bring. And still he did not move on. The horse shifted beneath him, restless in the biting wind, while Adrian remained still, studying the faint rise and fall of her breath, so shallow it could have been imagined. And for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, he considered leaving her there, letting the snow finish what the world had begun, because that was how things ended in places like this, quietly, without witness. But then her fingers moved, barely, a small, stubborn motion against the frozen ground, and something unfamiliar flickered through him, not warmth, not kindness, but recognition, as if he had seen that quiet refusal before and knew too well what it meant to be left with nothing and still choose not to disappear. He dismounted in one fluid motion, boots sinking into the snow as he crossed the distance between them, the storm clawing at his coat but failing to slow him. And when he reached her he crouched without hesitation, his presence casting a shadow over her still form, his eyes tracing the pale lines of her face, the frost clinging to her lashes, the faint imprint of hardship etched into every detail. She was lighter than he expected when he lifted her, her weight barely there, as though the storm had already begun to claim her, and yet there was a steadiness in the way her head fell against his shoulder, a quiet trust that she had not chosen, but that he now carried with him whether he wished to or not. Adrian turned without looking back, securing her against him as he mounted once more, the horse responding instantly, as if sensing the shift in purpose, and together they moved through the storm with a new direction, cutting a path toward the distant silhouette of stone that rose against the darkening sky. The castle waited as it always did, silent and unwelcoming, its towers lost in shadow, a place that had long since forgotten the meaning of refuge. And yet as its gates emerged through the swirling snow, Adrian did not slow, his expression as unreadable as the night itself, because whatever this was, whatever had made him stop, it was not something he intended to understand, only something he had already chosen not to ignore. The gates opened before he spoke a word, as though the castle itself recognized its master's return and the burden he carried, the heavy iron groaning softly against the wind while torchlight flickered along the stone walls, casting long shadows that stretched like silent witnesses to his arrival, and Adrian Blackwood rode straight through without slowing, the weight in his arms unmoving but not lifeless. Not yet. Inside, the warmth did not greet them gently but pressed in with a quiet intensity, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and old stone, a stark contrast to the endless white outside, and servants appeared at a distance, hesitant, their movements careful as they caught sight of the figure cradled against his chest, because this was not something they had seen before, not in this house where silence ruled and doors remained closed. He dismounted in a single controlled motion, his boots striking the marble floor with a muted echo as he carried her across the vast entrance hall, past towering pillars and dimly lit corridors that seemed to swallow sound. And still he did not look at anyone, did not explain, as though the presence of the girl required no justification beyond his decision alone. A woman stepped forward at last, her expression composed but questioning, the housekeeper who had served long enough to understand when not to ask. Yet even she could not hide the flicker of surprise in her eyes as Adrian passed her without pause, his voice low and steady when he finally spoke, instructing only what was necessary. A room prepared, warmth, nothing more, and the command carried a finality that left no space for doubt. The chamber he chose was not one often used, tucked away from the main corridors where the walls held their secrets more closely, and as he crossed the threshold, the fire had already been lit, its glow soft against the cold stone, waiting as though it had been expecting them all along. He placed her down with a care that did not match the hardness of his expression, adjusting the heavy blankets with precise movements, ensuring the warmth reached her before stepping back, his gaze lingering not on her face but on the subtle rise of her chest, the quiet proof that she had not yet slipped beyond reach. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault against the castle walls, but within this room there was a stillness that felt deliberate, contained, as if the world had been narrowed to this single moment, this fragile line between survival and surrender. Adrian remained where he stood, silent, watching as the frost began to fade from her skin, as the faintest color returned to her lips, and something in the steady rhythm of her breathing unsettled him in a way he did not care to name, because this was not part of the life he had chosen, not part of the order he maintained with such rigid control, and yet he did not leave, not immediately, as though stepping away would undo whatever unseen force had brought her into his path, and for the first time in a long while, the silence of the castle did not feel entirely empty. Time passed in silence, measured only by the slow rise and fall of her breath and the steady crackle of the fire. And though the storm continued to rage beyond the thick stone walls, its fury seemed distant here, reduced to a muffled whisper against glass and granite, as if even nature itself could not fully reach into this guarded space. Clara stirred long before she opened her eyes, her body remembering the cold before her mind could follow, a faint tension running through her limbs as warmth surrounded her in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, and her fingers moved first, brushing against soft fabric instead of frozen ground, the contrast sharp enough to pull her closer to waking. When her eyes finally parted, the light was dim, amber and flickering, shadows dancing across high ceilings and unfamiliar walls, and for a moment she did not move, her gaze fixed upward as though the world above her might shift again if she breathed too deeply. Confusion came slowly, like a tide creeping in, bringing with it fragments of memory, the storm, the endless white, the moment she had fallen, and then nothing, only silence after that, a silence that now felt heavier because it had not been the end. She pushed herself up slightly, her movements careful, testing, as though expecting pain or cold to return at any moment, but neither came, only the steady warmth of blankets and the distant echo of a place she did not know. and it was that unfamiliarity that finally sharpened her senses, drawing her fully awake. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the stone walls, the carved details of furniture that spoke of wealth and age, the fire burning strong in the hearth, and then the door, closed, solid, a quiet barrier between her and whatever lay beyond. She did not call out, did not reach for it, because something deeper than fear held her still, a quiet instinct that told her this place was not random, not chance, that someone had brought her here, and that someone had chosen not to let her die. The thought settled uneasily within her, not as comfort, but as a question. Because survival had not come freely in her life, it had always been given with a cost she could not yet see. The sound of footsteps beyond the door reached her then, faint but unmistakable, and her breath slowed, her body stilling as she listened, each step measured, controlled, approaching with a certainty that left no doubt as to who it belonged to. Clara's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the blanket, her gaze fixed on the door as the handle shifted. And though she did not yet know his name, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. The man who had carried her from the storm had not simply saved her, he had brought her somewhere she might not be allowed to leave. The door opened without haste, the sound deliberate, controlled, and Clara did not look away as the man stepped inside. His presence filling the room in a way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with something colder, something quieter, like the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself to be understood. Adrian Blackwood closed the door behind him with a soft finality, his gaze already fixed on her, as though he had expected her to be awake, as though nothing about this moment surprised him. And for a brief second neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them not awkward but measured, each observing, each waiting. Clara was the first to move, pushing herself upright despite the lingering weakness in her body, her chin lifting just enough to meet his eyes directly. And though the warmth of the room surrounded her, there was still a trace of the storm in her, something unbroken, something that refused to appear small even now. He noticed it immediately, the quiet defiance, the absence of panic where most would have shown fear, and it did not soften his expression, but it held his attention in a way he did not intend. "You are awake," he said at last, his voice low, even, carrying neither concern nor indifference, simply a statement of fact, and Clara studied him for a moment before answering, her voice steady despite the dryness in her throat. "I am." And the simplicity of her reply seemed to settle something unseen in the air, as though both of them understood that this was not a conversation that would follow ordinary rules. Adrian stepped further into the room, the faint light catching along the edge of the scar that traced across his face, not concealed, not explained, simply present as part of him, and Clara did not look away from it, did not react as others might have, and that, more than anything, made him pause. "You were found in the storm," he continued, his gaze sharp, measuring, "far beyond any road that would lead you somewhere safe." And though the words were calm, there was something beneath them, a question that had not yet been spoken aloud. Clara's fingers tightened slightly against the blanket, not from fear but from thought, and when she answered, she chose her words carefully. "I did not intend to be safe." And the honesty of it lingered between them, unexpected and unguarded, drawing a faint shift in Adrian's expression that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. He watched her more closely now, not as one would watch a stranger, but as one would examine something that did not fit the pattern he had already decided upon. And for a moment longer he said nothing, as though weighing whether her presence here was a complication or something else entirely. Then, with a quiet certainty that left no room for argument, he spoke again. "You will remain here until you are strong enough to leave." A statement that might have sounded like mercy if not for the way it was delivered, precise, controlled, leaving no space for refusal, and Clara held his gaze, understanding the truth beneath it, that this was not simply an offer of shelter, but the setting of a boundary she had not chosen. Still, she did not protest, did not look away, because somewhere beneath the unease, beneath the unanswered questions, there was one thing she could not deny. She had been given something she had not expected to receive, and whatever this place was, whatever this man intended, it had already changed the course of her fate. Clara did not sleep again after he left, not fully, because the warmth of the room could not quiet the awareness that had settled deep within her, a steady presence that told her she was no longer in danger of the storm, but not yet free of something else, something she could not name. The fire burned lower as the hours passed, its glow softening into embers that painted the walls in dim, shifting shadows, and she remained still beneath the blankets, listening to the silence of the castle, a silence that was not empty but watchful, as if every corridor held its breath. When morning came, it did not arrive with sunlight, but with a pale gray light that filtered through tall windows, cold and distant, revealing more of the room than the night had allowed. And Clara rose carefully, her strength returning in small, measured ways, enough to stand, enough to take a step, though each movement reminded her how close she had come to losing even that. She crossed the room slowly, her fingers brushing against the carved edge of a table, grounding herself in something solid, something real, and when she reached the window, she paused, her breath catching not from weakness but from what she saw beyond the glass. The storm had not passed. It had only quieted, the world outside still buried beneath a vast, endless white. The road she had once followed now erased entirely, as though it had never existed, and for a long moment she simply stared, understanding with a clarity that settled heavily in her chest that there was no returning to where she had come from. Not today, perhaps not ever. The sound of the door opening behind her did not startle her this time, and she turned slowly, already expecting him, already aware that he would come again not out of curiosity, but out of something more deliberate, something controlled. Adrian entered without speaking, his presence as composed as before, though his gaze moved over her with a brief, assessing glance that took in the fact that she was standing, that she had chosen to rise rather than remain where he had left her, and something unreadable flickered in his eyes before it disappeared beneath the same calm detachment. "You should not be on your feet yet," he said, not as a reprimand, but as a quiet observation, and Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her voice steady. "I am no longer in the snow." And the simplicity of her answer carried more meaning than the words themselves, a quiet acknowledgement that she understood her situation, that she would not pretend weakness where she did not feel it. Adrian regarded her for a moment longer, as though weighing that response, and then he stepped further into the room, closing the distance just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore, though not enough to invade, maintaining that precise balance that defined everything about him. "The storm will remain for several days," he said, his tone unchanged. "No one leaves these grounds until it does." And though it sounded like information, it carried the unmistakable weight of certainty, of rules that did not bend. Clara turned her gaze briefly back to the window, to the endless white beyond, and then returned it to him, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as she answered, "Then I will remain, not as agreement, not as submission, but as recognition of the reality before her." And for the first time since he had brought her into this place, Adrian did not immediately respond, because something in her words, in the quiet way she accepted without yielding, lingered in the space between them, altering it in ways neither of them had yet begun to understand. The days did not pass with noise or movement, but with a quiet that seemed to press into every corner of the castle, and Clara began to understand that time here was not marked by hours, but by the slow unfolding of things left unspoken, the subtle shifts in light across stone walls, the distant echo of footsteps that never hurried. She had been given clothing that was not hers, simple but warm, and though she accepted it without question, there was something about wearing it that reminded her. She was a guest only by circumstance, not by choice, and certainly not by invitation. She walked the length of the chamber more easily now, her strength returning with each step, yet she did not attempt the door, not because she believed it locked, but because something in the stillness of this place suggested that boundaries here were not made of wood or iron, but of understanding, of knowing where one stood without needing to test it. Beyond the walls, the storm continued its quiet dominion, the landscape unchanged, the world beyond unreachable, and within that isolation, Clara found her thoughts turning not to escape, but to the man who had brought her here, not out of gratitude, but out of a growing awareness that nothing about him aligned with the stories she had once believed about men of power. She saw him again not long after, not in the chamber, but in one of the long corridors where tall windows revealed only endless white beyond, and he stood there as though the storm belonged to him, his posture still, his gaze distant yet sharp, as if he could see through the snow itself. He did not turn when she approached, though he knew she was there, the subtle shift in his attention the only sign of acknowledgement, and for a moment they stood in silence, side by side, yet not close, two figures bound by circumstance rather than choice. "You walk further each day," he said at last, his voice low, measured, as though stating a fact rather than offering approval, and Clara inclined her head slightly, her response calm. "I have reason to." And though the words were simple, they carried something beneath them, something he did not immediately dismiss. Adrian's gaze shifted then, not fully to her, but enough to consider, enough to recognize that she was not merely recovering, but observing, learning, and perhaps even deciding something he had not yet anticipated. "Most would ask when they may leave," he said after a pause, his tone unchanged, and Clara looked out at the storm before answering, her voice steady. "Most have somewhere to return to," and the quiet truth of it settled between them, heavier than any argument, because it revealed more than either had intended to say. For the first time, Adrian turned fully toward her, his expression as composed as ever, yet there was something sharper in his eyes now, something that suggested her presence here was no longer incidental, no longer temporary in the way he had first assumed. The corridor remained silent, the storm beyond unbroken, and as Clara met his gaze without hesitation, it became clear that whatever had begun in the snow had not ended. With her survival, it had only changed form, becoming something quieter, something deeper, something neither of them had yet chosen, but both were already part of. That night, the castle did not sleep, and neither did Clara, though she lay still beneath the heavy blankets, her eyes tracing the faint patterns of candlelight along the ceiling as if they might reveal something hidden within the silence. Because the quiet here was never empty, it carried weight, presence, the sense that every shadow held a story that had not yet been told. She rose again before dawn, drawn not by restlessness, but by something quieter, something that felt like recognition, rather than curiosity, and the corridors greeted her with the same measured stillness, long stretches of stone and dim light that seemed to narrow the world into something controlled, contained, as though nothing here existed without purpose. Her steps were soft against the polished floor, her movements unhurried, yet deliberate, and she did not question where she was going until she found herself before a door unlike the others, darker, heavier, its surface marked by time rather than use, as if it had not been opened in years. She paused, not out of fear, but because something about it felt different, and though she did not reach for the handle, she felt the quiet pull of it, as though whatever lay beyond belonged to the same silence that surrounded him. "That room is not meant to be entered." Adrian's voice came from behind her, low and steady, not raised, not sharp, but absolute, and Clara turned slowly, meeting his gaze without surprise, as though she had expected him to appear, as though his presence here was as constant as the walls themselves. "And yet it remains," she replied, her voice calm, thoughtful, and the answer lingered between them. Not a challenge, not defiance, but something closer to observation, something that did not fit easily into the order he maintained. Adrian stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to shift the space between them, his presence grounding the moment in something more solid, more real, and for a brief second his eyes flickered to the door before returning to her, as though deciding whether to speak or remain silent. "Some things remain because they are not meant to be disturbed," he said at last, and there was something in his tone that carried more than instruction, something that hinted at memory, at a past that had not faded but had instead been locked away, preserved within walls that did not forget. Clara considered him for a moment, her gaze steady, searching not for answers but for truth, and when she spoke again, her words were quieter, but no less certain. "Or because no one has dared to." And the difference between the two settled into the space between them, subtle but undeniable, drawing a stillness from him that was not his usual control, but something deeper, something closer to reflection. The silence stretched, neither of them moving, the door behind her remaining closed, yet no longer unnoticed, and outside the storm continued its endless fall, covering the world beyond in white, erasing paths, burying what had been, while within these walls, something else was beginning to shift, not loudly, not suddenly, but in the quiet recognition that neither of them had remained unchanged since the night the storm had brought her here. The silence that followed did not break when he turned away, nor when his footsteps faded into the depths of the corridor, because something of him remained, not in sound, but in the space he had occupied, in the weight of words left unfinished. And Clara stood there a moment longer before the closed door, her gaze resting on its unmoving surface as though it had shifted without opening. She did not reach for it, did not test the boundary he had set, but neither did she step back immediately, because understanding did not come from defiance. It came from patience, from knowing when to wait and when to see. When she finally turned, the corridor seemed different, not in its shape or light, but in the way it held her now, as though she no longer moved through it as a stranger, but as someone being quietly acknowledged by its silence. The days that followed carried a subtle change, one that did not announce itself but revealed itself in small moments, in the way servants no longer avoided her presence but regarded her with a careful curiosity, in the way doors once closed now remained slightly ajar as she passed, not inviting, but no longer denying. Adrian was less visible, though never absent, his presence felt in the order of the house, in the quiet precision with which everything functioned, and when she did see him, it was never by chance, always in spaces where distance could be maintained, where words could remain measured. Yet something had shifted in those encounters, something that did not belong to control alone. She found him again in the library, a room unlike the others, where the silence was deeper, layered with years of thought and memory, the walls lined with volumes that had outlived their readers, and he stood near the tall windows, the gray light outlining his figure against the storm that had not yet released its hold on the world. This time, he spoke first without turning. "You continue to walk where most would not." And Clara stepped into the room fully, her gaze moving over the space before settling on him, her answer steady. "Most are told not to." And the quiet truth of it lingered, not as challenge, but as recognition of something they both understood. Adrian turned then, his expression unchanged, yet his eyes sharper, more focused than before, as though he had begun to see her not as a temporary presence, but as something that required attention, consideration. "And you are not concerned by that," he said, and Clara held his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm. "Concern has never changed the outcome of anything I have faced," and the words carried no bitterness, no attempt to persuade, only fact, and it was that absence of emotion that struck deeper than any argument. For a moment, the room held its breath, the fire in the hearth burning low, the storm beyond the glass unbroken, and Adrian's gaze remained on her longer than it should have, as though measuring not her strength, but something less visible, something that did not yield easily to understanding. Then, with a quiet finality that masked more than it revealed, he spoke again. "There are parts of this house that are not meant to be explored." And though the words echoed what he had said before, they carried a different weight now, not just instruction, but warning, and Clara inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because she understood that what he guarded was not the house itself, but something within it, something that had not been left behind. And as she turned to leave, the silence followed her once more, no longer empty, but filled with the quiet certainty that whatever remained hidden within these walls would not stay that way forever. The warning did not fade after she left the library. It lingered in the air like the last note of a melody that refused to end, and Clara carried it with her through the corridors, not as fear, but as a quiet awareness that something within these walls was no longer distant, no longer hidden entirely from her understanding. The castle had begun to reveal itself in fragments, not through grand gestures, but through small details that did not align, doors that remained closed longer than necessary, servants who paused just a moment too long when passing certain halls, and always that same subtle tension beneath the stillness, as if the house itself held its breath around something it was not willing to release. She did not seek the door again, not directly, yet her steps found their way toward that part of the castle without conscious thought, drawn not by defiance, but by something quieter, Something that felt like an answer waiting to be understood. The corridor was darker here. The light thinner, filtered through narrow windows that allowed only a pale suggestion of day. And the silence was deeper, heavier, as though sound itself moved more carefully within these walls. Clara slowed as she approached, her gaze steady, her steps measured, and though she had no intention of crossing the boundaries set before her, she could not ignore the sense that something had changed since the last time she had stood there. The door remained closed, as it had been, its surface unchanged, yet the stillness around it felt different, less guarded, as if time itself had shifted in a way too subtle to name. She stood before it once more, not reaching, not testing, simply observing, and in that quiet moment, she became aware of something she had not noticed before, a faint detail, nearly hidden, a small imperfection in the wood near the handle, worn not by age alone but by use, by repetition, by someone who had once stood where she now stood, not once, but many times. The realization settled slowly, not as certainty, but as possibility, and Clara's gaze lingered on that mark longer than it should have, as though it held more than its surface suggested. "You do not forget easily." Adrian's voice came from behind her, closer this time, quieter, and when she turned, he was already watching her, his expression composed, yet his eyes sharper than before, as if he had followed not her steps, but her thoughts. "Nor do you," she replied, her voice steady, and the words carried no accusation, only recognition, and something in his gaze shifted at that, not enough to be called surprise, but enough to break the perfect stillness he maintained. He stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing in a way that altered the air itself, making it heavier, more deliberate, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them with a weight that was no longer empty. "There are reasons certain doors remain closed," he said at last, his voice low, controlled, yet there was something beneath it now, something less certain, something that did not belong to command alone, and Clara held his gaze without retreat, her answer quiet but unwavering. "And there are reasons they do not remain untouched," and the difference between those truths settled into the space between them, unspoken yet understood. The storm outside had not yet ended, the world beyond still hidden beneath endless white. But within these walls, something had shifted once more, something neither of them could undo. Because what had begun as survival had become something else entirely, something that no longer belonged to chance, but to choice. The space between them did not close, yet it no longer felt distant, as if something unseen had drawn a line neither of them intended to cross, and yet neither could step away from. And Clara held his gaze with a steadiness that did not challenge but did not yield, because whatever this place was, whatever he guarded, she had already stepped into its shadow. Adrian did not speak at once, his silence stretching longer than before, not controlled in the way it usually was, but waited, as though the words he might choose carried consequences he had not yet decided to accept. And when he finally moved, it was not away from her, but toward the door behind her, his presence shifting the air as he reached for the handle with a deliberate calm that suggested decision rather than impulse. Clara did not turn immediately, her eyes remaining on him as his hand paused for the briefest moment before resting against the worn wood. The same place she had noticed before, the faint mark left by repetition, by memory, and something in that hesitation told her more than any explanation could have. "You should not see this," he said, though the words came quieter than before, less command and more acknowledgement, and Clara answered without breaking her composure. "Then you should not open it." And the truth of that settled between them, simple and undeniable, yet it did not stop him. The door opened slowly, not with resistance, but with a softness that suggested it had not been forgotten, only left undisturbed, and the air beyond carried a stillness deeper than any corridor, a silence untouched by time or presence. Clara turned then, not out of curiosity, but because something in the moment demanded witness, and what she saw was not what she had expected, not darkness, not decay, but a room preserved with a quiet precision, every detail untouched, as though it had been waiting, not abandoned, but held in place by something stronger than absence. The light within was dim, filtered through heavy curtains that softened everything it touched, and at the center of it stood a single chair, positioned as though someone had only just risen from it, leaving behind the faint suggestion of a presence that had not yet faded. Clara stepped forward without thinking, her movements slow, careful, as though the space itself required respect, and she felt it then, not fear, not unease, but something heavier, something that lingered beneath the surface of the room, something that did not belong to the present. Adrian remained at the threshold, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the room itself, and for the first time since she had known him, the stillness he carried seemed to shift, not breaking, but revealing something beneath it, something that had been held in silence for longer than either of them could measure. "This is where nothing changes," he said at last, his voice low, not cold, not distant, but something else entirely, something that did not seek to explain, only to state what had always been true. And Clara stood there, understanding not the details, but the weight of it, the reason the door had remained closed, not because it was forbidden, but because it had never been left behind. And as she turned back toward him, meeting his gaze once more, it became clear that whatever had been hidden here was no longer contained, because she had seen it, and in seeing it, something between them had shifted beyond return. Clara did not step further into the room after that first moment, not because she feared what remained within it, but because she understood that it was not a place meant to be crossed lightly, not a space to be explored as one would any other, but something closer to a boundary between what had been and what still lingered, untouched by time. She turned slowly, her gaze returning to Adrian, and for the first time there was no distance in the way she looked at him, no careful observation, only a quiet recognition of something that had not been spoken but could no longer be ignored. He had not moved from the doorway, his presence still anchored to the threshold as though he belonged equally to both sides, the present and whatever had been preserved behind that door, and in that stillness, the weight he carried was no longer hidden beneath control alone. "You never left it behind," Clara said, her voice low, not questioning, not accusing, simply stating what had become clear, and the words settled into the room with a finality that did not demand response. Yet Adrian did not look away, did not retreat into silence as he had before. Instead, something in his expression shifted, not breaking, but softening in a way that was almost imperceptible, as though the truth of her words had not surprised him, only confirmed what he had long chosen not to name. "Some things are not meant to be left," he replied, and there was no defense in his tone, no attempt to justify, only acceptance. And it was that absence of resistance that altered the space between them more than anything else could have. Clara held his gaze a moment longer, then turned back toward the room, her eyes moving once more over the details that had remained unchanged, the careful arrangement, the quiet stillness, and she understood then that this was not preservation out of habit, but out of something deeper, something that had shaped the man before her in ways no storm ever could. "And yet you remain here," she said after a pause, her voice thoughtful, not with it, but beside it, and the distinction lingered, subtle but undeniable, drawing a brief stillness from him that spoke louder than any reply. Adrian's gaze shifted then, not to the room, but to her, and for the first time there was something in it that did not belong to control or distance, something closer to awareness, to the realization that she had seen not just the space, but what it meant. "You speak as though you understand," he said, though there was no challenge in his voice, only quiet observation. And Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her answer steady. "I understand what it means to keep something because losing it would change who you are." And the truth of it settled between them, bridging something that had remained unspoken until now. The silence that followed was different from the others, no longer guarded, no longer distant, but filled with a quiet acknowledgement that neither of them had intended, yet neither could deny, and outside the storm continued its endless fall, the world beyond still unreachable, while within these walls, something far less visible had begun to shift, not through force, not through time, but through understanding. And as Adrian stepped back from the doorway at last, allowing the room to remain as it had always been, it became clear that what had changed was not what he guarded, but the fact that it was no longer his alone to carry. The door closed behind them without sound, the room returning to its quiet stillness as though nothing had been disturbed, and yet everything had changed, not in what remained within those walls, but in what had been seen, acknowledged, and carried forward. Clara walked beside Adrian through the corridor, not as a guest uncertain of her place, but as someone who now understood the weight that shaped this house, the silence that defined it, and the man who had chosen to remain within it. Neither of them spoke at first. The quiet between them no longer filled with distance, but with something steadier, something that did not demand words to exist. When they reached the tall windows overlooking the endless white beyond, Clara paused, her gaze lifting to the horizon where sky and snow blurred into one, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not feel the pull of what lay beyond, did not measure the distance as something she needed to cross. "The storm is breaking," Adrian said, his voice low, and though the words were simple, they carried a shift, not just in the weather, but in what would follow. Clara watched as the wind softened, as the relentless fall of snow slowed into something quieter, and she understood what it meant, that the path back would soon return, that the world she had left behind would no longer be unreachable. She turned to him then, her expression calm, unchanged. Yet there was something in her gaze that had not been there before, something certain, something decided. "Then I will leave," she said, not as a question, not as hesitation, but as acknowledgement of what must come, and Adrian did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on her in a way that held more than observation, more than control, as though he were measuring something he had not intended to consider. The silence stretched, the castle itself seeming to wait, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet finality that did not conceal what lay beneath it. "You may." And though the words granted her freedom, they did not release the moment, did not diminish what had formed between them in the days that had passed. Clara inclined her head slightly, accepting not just the permission, but the truth within it, that leaving would not undo what had been set in motion, and, as she turned toward the corridor, toward the path that would soon lead her beyond these walls, she paused only once, her hand resting briefly against the cold stone as if marking the place not as something she had escaped, but as something she had known. Adrian remained where he stood, his gaze following her not with restraint, but with something quieter, something that did not seek to hold her back, yet did not release her entirely either. And in that moment, the distance between them became something neither absence nor presence could define. Outside, the storm faded into memory, the first clear break appearing along the horizon, light pressing through where darkness had lingered too long, and within the castle, the silence shifted once more, no longer untouched, no longer unchanged, because some paths, once crossed, did not disappear, they remained, waiting, not for return, but for the moment when what had begun would find its way back, in a form neither of them could yet foresee.